It was a spring morning in New York City, May 25th, 1979. The streets of Soho were alive with the sounds of a city just waking up. Delivery trucks rattling over cobblestone, the smell of bagels drifting from corner bakeries, parents rushing off to work. In the middle of this ordinary Friday, a 6-year-old boy named Etan Patz picked up his small backpack, kissed his mother goodbye, and stepped out the door of his family's loft apartment. It was supposed to be a milestone. For the very first time, Etan was allowed to walk the short 2 blocks to his school bus stop all by himself. It was a decision that, at the time, seemed safe, even normal. In the late 70s, kids in New York walked to school, played outside, and roamed their neighborhoods without fear. Parents believed they could trust their streets, their neighbors, their city. But Etan never made it onto that bus. Somewhere between the front door of his home and the corner where the yellow school bus waited, he vanished, without a sound, without a trace. When Etan's mother realized he hadn't returned home that afternoon, the panic that swept through the Patz family soon spread across the nation. Neighbors joined frantic searches. Detectives canvassed block after block, and Etan's face began to appear everywhere, from telephone poles to the front pages of newspapers. He would later become one of the first missing children whose photo appeared on a milk carton, a haunting reminder at breakfast tables across America that no child was truly safe. This wasn't just the story of one missing boy. It was the moment America lost its sense of innocence. The disappearance of Etan Patz would forever change the way we think about childhood, safety, and trust. It sparked fear, outrage, and ultimately reform, but it also left behind decades of unanswered questions and a mystery that haunted investigators, parents, and an entire nation for nearly 40 years. And it all began with one small boy, on one ordinary morning, walking to the bus stop for the very first time. The Patz family lived at 113 Prince Street in the Soho neighborhood of Manhattan. Back then, Soho was not the fashionable district it would later become, but a mix of artists' lofts and working families. It was a place where children played on sidewalks, and neighbors often knew each other by name. Etan left home around 8 a.m., carrying his school bag, and in his pocket, a $1 he planned to spend on a soda at a nearby corner store. The bus stop was only 2 blocks away, at West Broadway and Prince Street. It was a short walk, one his parents believed would be safe. Witnesses later reported seeing him along the route. One local shopkeeper remembered Etan coming into the bodega that morning, but he never made it onto the school bus. By the time classes began, Etan was already missing. That afternoon, when the school bus returned children to the stop, Julie noticed something was wrong. Etan was not there. At first, she assumed he might have stayed behind at school or gone to a friend's house. But phone calls quickly confirmed the unsettling truth. Etan had never arrived at school. The realization hit like a thunderbolt. Julie immediately called her husband Stanley and contacted police. Within hours, the search for Etan began. Neighbors canvassed the streets, calling his name. Police officers checked nearby basements, rooftops, and alleyways. Flyers with Etan's picture were prepared and distributed. But as day turned to night, the gravity of the situation grew heavier. This was no simple case of a child wandering off. Something far more serious had happened. For Stanley and Julie Patz, that night was the beginning of an ordeal that would never truly end. Etan's bed remained empty. His backpack and toys sat untouched. Their 6-year-old son had vanished somewhere between his front door and the school bus stop. What should have been a routine morning in a bustling Manhattan neighborhood became the day that changed everything. The disappearance of Etan Patz would not only devastate one family, but also awaken an entire nation to the frightening reality that children could disappear without a trace, even in the middle of a city, even in broad daylight. When Julie Patz realized Etan had not made it to school, she called the police immediately. Unlike many missing child cases at the time, where authorities often advised parents to wait 24 hours, the New York Police Department responded without delay. Etan was just 6 years old, and officers understood the urgency. Within hours, a massive search was underway in Soho. Dozens of police officers, neighbors, and volunteers combed the streets, knocking on doors, calling Etan's name and checking basements, stairwells, and rooftops. The tight-knit community mobilized quickly. Flyers with Etan's photograph, taken by his mother Julie, an avid photographer, were printed and distributed throughout Lower Manhattan. Helicopters hovered over the neighborhood, and trained dogs were brought in to try to trace Etan's scent. The search extended to subway stations, vacant lots, and industrial buildings. Despite the scale of the operation, no solid clues emerged. That first night, the Patz family home became the center of frantic activity. Detectives interviewed neighbors and shopkeepers, trying to piece together Etan's final steps. Several witnesses said they had seen him walking toward the bus stop, and a bodega owner recalled him stopping by the store to buy a soda. But from that moment onward, the trail went cold. For Julie and Stanley, the hours dragged into an endless blur of fear and disbelief. Their apartment, filled with Etan's toys and drawings, became unbearable reminders of his absence. By the second day, Etan's case had already grown beyond a local search. News outlets picked up the story, and Etan's face appeared in newspapers across New York. His disappearance struck a chord. How could a child vanish in broad daylight in the middle of Manhattan? The sense of unease spread far beyond Soho. Despite the intense effort, the search yielded nothing. No clothing, no belongings, no witnesses who could say for certain what had happened after Etan left the bodega. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Those first 48 hours, so critical in any missing child case, ended with no answers. For the Patz family, hope remained, but it was already shadowed by a growing fear. What began as a neighborhood search was becoming one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. In the weeks after Etan's disappearance, the search grew into one of the largest missing child investigations New York had ever seen. Detectives interviewed neighbors, shopkeepers, and anyone who might have crossed paths with the boy that morning. Hundreds of tips poured in, but each ended in disappointment. Authorities quickly realized this was no ordinary case. Stranger abductions were considered extremely rare at the time, so police first focused on people Etan might have known. Several individuals came under scrutiny: a local handyman with a troubling history, and a neighborhood shop worker who had shown unusual interest in children. But without evidence, no charges could be filed. The Patz family worked tirelessly to keep Etan's face in the public eye. Julie's photographs of her son appeared in newspapers, on posters, and eventually across the country. Stanley and Julie gave interviews, refusing to let their son's story fade from the headlines. The FBI soon joined the search, expanding the investigation beyond New York City. Bus stations, airports, and highways were checked, and missing child alerts spread nationwide. But despite the scale of the operation, no trace of Etan was ever found. By the end of the summer, detectives had exhausted their leads. Every promising tip collapsed. Every suspect was cleared. What began as an urgent local search had become a haunting mystery, one that would linger over New York and over the Patz family for decades to come. Etan Patz's disappearance was more than just a heartbreaking family tragedy. It marked a turning point in how America thought about missing children. In 1979, there was no centralized system for tracking such cases, no national hotline, and very little public awareness about the dangers of child abduction. Etan's case changed all of that. One of the most powerful tools in keeping Etan's face alive was Julie Patz's photography. Unlike most families, the Patzes had high-quality professional photographs of their son, bright, clear, and immediately recognizable. Those images were reproduced in newspapers across the country and eventually on posters and billboards. In the early 1980s, Etan's case inspired an unprecedented idea: printing the faces of missing children on milk cartons. For the first time, Millions of families eating breakfast each morning were confronted with the haunting reminder that children could vanish without a trace. Etan was one of the very first children to appear in this campaign, making his case unforgettable for an entire generation. His disappearance also drew attention from lawmakers and advocates. Parents began demanding better systems for responding to missing child cases. Until then, police often told families to wait and see before filing a report, sometimes losing the most critical hours of a search. Etan's case highlighted just how dangerous that delay could be. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan declared May 25th, the anniversary of Etan's disappearance, National Missing Children's Day. Each year, ceremonies and awareness campaigns remind the country of the ongoing crisis and the need to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Etan's case also helped lead to the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, in 1984. Founded by John and Reve Walsh after the kidnapping and murder of their own son, Adam, the center became a nationwide hub for resources, databases, and rapid response. Etan's disappearance was one of the cases most often cited as proof that such an organization was desperately needed. The ripple effects went even further. Public schools began teaching children about stranger danger. Communities started neighborhood watch programs. Families who once assumed their children were safe walking to school began to rethink everyday routines. For the Patz family, none of these national changes could erase their pain. But Etan's disappearance forced America to confront a terrifying truth, that a child could vanish in the span of a single city block. His case rewrote the rules of parenting, policing, and public policy, and his name became forever linked to the movement to protect missing children. Throughout the 1980s, detectives kept circling back to one name, Jose Antonio Ramos. A convicted child molester from Pennsylvania, Ramos had an unsettling link to the Patz family. He once dated a woman who occasionally babysat Etan. In 1982, Ramos was arrested for abusing young boys. During questioning, he admitted being attracted to children who looked like Etan. Later, in conversations with investigators and fellow inmates, he hinted at abducting a boy in New York on the very same day Etan disappeared. His descriptions often matched Etan closely. Despite these admissions, Ramos never gave a clear, prosecutable confession. The FBI eventually labeled him the prime suspect, but without physical evidence, no body, no crime scene, no forensic link, prosecutors couldn't bring formal charges. In 1989, Stanley and Julie Patz filed a civil suit against Ramos. In 2004, a Manhattan judge ruled him civilly liable for Etan's death. Yet Ramos remained in prison only for unrelated crimes, never tried in a criminal court for Etan's disappearance. For years, Ramos dominated the investigation. Many believed the case was solved in all but name, while others worried the focus on him might have blinded authorities to other suspects. By the late 1990s, 2 decades after Etan vanished, the case remained unresolved, an open wound for the Patz family, and a reminder to the nation of how fragile justice could be. In the early 2000s, more than 2 decades had passed since Etan Patz vanished. For most missing children's cases, that amount of time would have meant silence, with files collecting dust. But Etan's story never faded. His parents, Stanley and Julie, never stopped demanding answers, and the case continued to haunt New York City. In 2010, Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. made a bold decision. He would reopen the investigation. Advances in forensic science and a renewed push for leads gave authorities hope that something new might finally emerge. Detectives began re-examining old files, retracing witness statements, and re-interviewing anyone who might shed light on what had really happened that spring morning in 1979. The renewed efforts led to one of the most dramatic moments in the entire case. In April 2012, investigators focused on the basement of a building in Soho, just a block from the Patz home. The site had long been of interest, and ground-penetrating radar suggested possible disturbances in the soil. Over several tense days, FBI agents and NYPD officers tore through concrete and dug beneath the building, hoping to find what had been missing for 33 years: Etan's remains. The excavation drew massive media attention. News crews camped outside, neighbors watched anxiously, and the Patz family waited with a mixture of dread and hope. Could this finally be the breakthrough? But after extensive searches, nothing conclusive was found. No body, no personal belongings, no definitive evidence tying the site to Etan's disappearance. The disappointment was crushing. Once again, the case seemed to retreat into uncertainty, and yet the reopening of the investigation had a crucial effect. It reignited public awareness and encouraged new witnesses to come forward. Just weeks later, a shocking lead emerged, one that did not point back to José Ramos, but to someone else entirely. A man who had once worked in a small neighborhood bodega near the Patz home would come forward with a confession that stunned investigators, the public, and the Patz family. After decades of dead ends, authorities suddenly had a new suspect. The search in the Soho basement may not have uncovered Etan's remains, but it reopened a door to the truth. And this time, it would lead investigators to the person who ultimately stood trial for Etan's murder. In May 2012, after decades of dead ends, investigators finally received the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Pedro Hernandez, a former bodega clerk who had worked near the Patz family home in Soho, confessed to abducting Etan Patz on the morning of May 25, 1979. Hernandez, who had been living in a New Jersey halfway house, told police he had lured 6-year-old Etan into the bodega by offering him a soda, an ordinary gesture that would have seemed harmless to a child. Once inside, Hernandez said he strangled the boy, panicked, and later disposed of the body. He admitted details about the route from the Patz home and other elements of the morning, which only investigators and the family would have known. Authorities were cautious, aware that decades had passed and that memory and credibility could be unreliable. Hernandez had a history of mental illness and claimed to have acted impulsively without a long-standing plan. He was interrogated multiple times, and his statements were carefully compared against known facts. Investigators confirmed that many details aligned with the established timeline of Etan's disappearance. The confession did more than implicate Hernandez. It brought a long-sought sense of direction to a case that had haunted New York for over 30 years. For the Patz family, the confession was a mix of relief and renewed grief. After decades of uncertainty, they finally had an answer. Yet the details were horrifying, confirming their worst fears about what had happened to their son. The arrest of Hernandez in 2012 led to immediate charges of murder and kidnapping. It also sparked an intense media spotlight. The story that had begun on a quiet Manhattan street in 1979 now dominated headlines, documentaries, and public discourse about child safety, abduction, and justice, delayed but not denied. Hernandez's confession would later become central to 2 criminal trials. His lawyers argued diminished capacity due to mental illness, while prosecutors presented the timeline, his detailed knowledge, and the consistency of his statements as evidence of guilt. The confession, combined with decades of investigation, finally gave the criminal justice system a tangible path to closure. For the public, the shocking revelation was a reminder that even after decades of uncertainty, truth can surface, and that the shadow of one missing child can shape laws, awareness, and hearts for generations. Pedro Hernandez's confession led to one of the most closely followed trials in recent New York history. In 2015, he went to court facing charges of murder and kidnapping of Etan Patz. The trial reopened old wounds for the Patz family, the city, and a nation that had followed the case for more than 3 decades. Prosecutors presented a detailed timeline of Etan's disappearance, emphasizing Hernandez's knowledge of facts only the abductor could have known. They highlighted his confession, corroborated by numerous witness statements, and the careful reconstruction of that May morning in Soho. Hernandez's mental health history became a key point for the defense, which argued he lacked the capacity to form intent. The first trial ended in a deadlocked jury, resulting in a mistrial. It was a devastating setback for the Patz family, who had hoped that justice might finally bring closure. But in 2017, the case was retried, and this time the jury returned a guilty verdict. Pedro Hernandez was convicted of murder and kidnapping, bringing a measure of justice for Etan and his family, decades after that fateful morning in 1979. For Stanley and Julie Patz, the verdict did not erase the grief, but it confirmed what they had long feared and suspected. Their son's story, which had once seemed to vanish into the uncertainty of time, finally had an ending that acknowledged the truth. The case also cemented Etan Patz as a symbol of the broader movement to protect children. Etan's disappearance had already changed America. It led to the creation of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, inspired the milk carton campaigns, and shaped modern parental and law enforcement practices around child safety. His story reminds us that one missing child can spark a national awakening and lasting reform. And while justice was finally served, there are still children who go missing every day. If this video moved you, take a moment to report any information about missing children to your local authorities or organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Awareness and action save lives. If you want to stay informed about true crime stories that shaped history and to help spread awareness, subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it. Together, we can remember the victims, honor the families, and keep the stories of missing children alive.